Pilsen, Kansas, not so much of a town, but a community founded by Czech immigrants in east central Kansas, about 60 miles north of Wichita, was the home of Father Emil Kapaun. The St. John Nepomucene Church, built from trainloads of bricks by volunteer labor of the giving community of Pilsen in 1915, is the most prominent landmark in this community in the vast expanse of the Great Plains of Kansas. This church was home to a young Father, Emil Kapaun, who was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1940 and briefly served as its parish priest before answering the call of his country. The spirit of giving embodied by the community of Pilsen would have a profound and meaningful impact on the life of Father Emil Kapaun. In 1943, Father Kapaun was appointed auxiliary chaplain at the nearby Harrington Army Airfield that was training bomber crews during the Second World War. He joined the U.S. Army as a chaplain in 1944 and was sent to the India-Burma Theater, where he ministered to the troops and served in that theater of operations. Promoted to captain in January 1946, Father Kapaun briefly left the Army in May to obtain a Master's of Arts degree from the Catholic American University in Washington, D.C. Father Kapaun re-entered the Army in 1948 and served as chaplain at Fort Bliss, and then transferred to Japan in 1950 to serve with the 1st Cavalry Division that was performing occupation duty in Japan. In June 1950, the Communist North Korean Army crossed the 38th parallel that divided North and South Korea and rapidly advanced south. On 18 July, the 1st Cavalry Division landed at the Korean peninsula near Puhong, South Korea, on the southeastern side of the peninsula as part of the United Nations response to the aggression of the North Korean Army. While composed of armies from 16 United Nations member countries, the United States supplied 90% of the military forces in the Korean War. The initial months of the war were bleak for the United Nations forces as they had been pushed back to the southern tip of South Korea, forming what was known as the Pusan Perimeter. In September, General Douglas MacArthur initiated a masterful surprise attack at Incheon Harbor near Seoul, which effectively cut the North Korean Army supply lines and allowed the Allied United Nations forces to push the North Koreans back towards the Chinese border. In October, the tide of the war had shifted momentarily in favor of the United Nations forces, as the North Korean Army was being pushed back to a small perimeter along the Yalu River on the Chinese border. A false sense of optimism led to the belief that the war would be over by Thanksgiving or Christmas at the latest. On the 25th of October, several divisions of the Chinese Army infiltrated undetected by our military intelligence into North Korea and began fighting the South Korean troops that were in the vicinity of Unsan, North Korea. General Walton Walker ordered the 5th and 8th Cavalry Regiments that were part of the 1st Cavalry Division to relieve the beleaguered troops near Unsan. Chaplain Kapaun was a chaplain with the 3rd Battalion of the 8th Regiment. The 8th Cavalry Regiment arrived in Unsan on 29 October, with the 5th Regiment taking up positions to protect their rear to the south. On the 1st of November, elements of the Chinese Communist Army sprung an ambush on the 8th Regiment. The fighting was intense. By the early morning of the 2nd, the 8th Regiment was completely surrounded, and Chaplain Kapaun's battalion, 3rd, was in the most tenuous, isolated position. The battalion stood their ground and fought off successive human waves of Chinese army that assaulted their positions. The unforgiving Chinese assault decimated the 3rd Battalion, as they had exhausted their ammunition and were down to a fighting strength of only 200 troops, who were ordered to retreat as a last-ditch effort to save their lives. Chaplain Kapaun had been given a chance to retreat, as many able-bodied men were commanded to do, but he elected to stay behind to care for the wounded. This was the first of his many feats of sacrifice beyond the call of duty. Surviving soldiers told stories of valor on how Chaplain Kapaun would charge unmolested through a hail of gunfire to retrieve wounded soldiers and bring them back to areas of cover where their wounds could be treated or last rites could be administered. Tragically, the battle would decimate the 3rd Battalion, and they ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the men that retreated in small groups, most did not make it to friendly lines. This became one of the most devastating defeats to an American Army unit in this forgotten war. The miraculous tales of valor accomplished by Chaplain Kapaun are many. As a humanitarian, he gave aid to a wounded Chinese officer and then negotiated with him to save the lives of the American soldiers that were ultimately captured. Armed only with a deep faith, strong will, and a need to serve others, Chaplain Kapaun approached a Chinese soldier who was preparing to execute a wounded soldier. Kapaun pushed the gun away from the soldier's head and then picked the soldier up and carried him to safety as the Chinese soldier, who moments earlier was preparing to fire his weapon, stood there dumbfounded. Knowing that the wounded soldiers would be executed, Chaplain Kapaun lifted this soldier onto his back and asked all other able-bodied soldiers to do the same as they began a forced march of more than 80 miles north to Prison Camp 5 on the Yalu River near the Chinese border. His leadership inspired others to carry their wounded comrades the entire distance. Once in prison, Chaplain Kapaun would routinely sneak out of his quarters at night and venture into the nearby farm fields and retrieve as much millet and other vegetables as he could and bring back to the enlisted soldiers who were isolated from Kapaun and the other officers. He did as much as he could to care for the wounds of the suffering and share his meager rations with those who, like him, were starving. He was a good thief. He stole not only coffee and tea from his captors, but the kettle to boil water. His repeated efforts to inspire and sustain his fellow captive soldiers were constant and nothing short of miraculous. His spirit of self-sacrifice took its toll on him, and by late spring, a blood clot formed in his leg, and then he developed pneumonia. His fellow troops did the best they could to nurture and sustain him, but by May, his Chinese captors took him to an isolated hut on a nearby mountaintop in what they described as a hospital. Our troops called it a death house, as no one emerged from that horrid place alive. On May 23rd, an emaciated Chaplain Kapaun succumbed to his conditions. Tales of Chaplain Kapaun's valor reached higher headquarters, and on August 18, 1951, he was awarded a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross, the highest award for valor that the Army can bestow. Upon war's end, returning POWs that were held with Chaplain Kapaun spread his stories of self-sacrifice and bravery. Upon review of his service record, the Army upgraded his Service Cross to a Medal of Honor, our nation's highest award for valor. In a ceremony at the White House in September 2013, President Barack Obama presented the Medal of Honor to Kapaun's nephew with a citation that reads as follows: Chaplain Captain Emil J. Kapaun, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Chaplain Emil J. Kapaun distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division during combat operations against an armed enemy in Unsan, North Korea on November 1st and 2nd, 1950. On November 1, as Chinese Communist forces viciously attacked friendly elements, Chaplain Kapaun calmly walked through withering enemy fire in order to provide comfort and medical aid to his comrades and rescue friendly wounded men from no man's land. Though the Americans successfully repelled the assault, they found themselves surrounded by the enemy. Facing annihilation, the able-bodied men were ordered to evacuate. However, Chaplain Kapaun, fully aware of his certain capture, elected to stay behind to help the wounded. After the enemy succeeded in breaking through the defense in the early morning hours of November 2nd, Chaplain Kapaun continually made rounds as hand-to-hand combat ensued. As Chinese Communist forces approached the American position, Chaplain Kapaun noticed an injured Chinese officer among the wounded and convinced him to negotiate the safe surrender of the American forces. Shortly after his capture, Chaplain Kapaun, with complete disregard for his personal safety and unwavering resolve, bravely pushed aside an enemy soldier preparing to execute Sergeant First Class Herbert A. Miller. Not only did Chaplain Kapaun's gallantry save the life of Sergeant Miller, but also his unparalleled courage and leadership inspired all those present, including those who might have otherwise fled in panic, to remain and fight the enemy until captured. Chaplain Kapaun's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, the 3rd Battalion, 8th Cavalry Regiment, 1st Cavalry Division, and the United States Army. inspired by a small community on the Great Plains of Kansas who sacrificed their spare time to build a church for the betterment of the community. Chaplain Emil Kapaun embodied a spirit of service before self. In 1993, Pope John Paul II named Father Emil Kapaun a servant of God as the first step necessary by the Catholic Church to attain sainthood. Captain Emil Kapaun, chaplain United States Army, served his fellow man in the most dangerous and depraved environments. He was not only a servant of God, but a servant to his fellow men, whose life inspires those of us who have never met him. He dedicated himself to the highest callings, and it now remains as our duty to remember his faith, service, sacrifice, and valor. Hello, I'm Colin Kimball with the North Texas Fallen Warrior Portrait Project. Thank you for watching this edition of our Duty to Remember, as we tell the stories of our local and national heroes. If you've enjoyed this presentation, please subscribe and share with your friends as we continue to produce new content. Thank you for watching.